morning Eastern Time, everyone. I'm Leandra Letterman. I'm the William W. Oliver Chair Emerita in Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. And let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. Luís Calderón Gómez is an assistant professor of law at Cardozo Law School, and he was previously a visiting assistant professor of tax law at the NYU School of Law. His research centers on tax law and philosophy, economic regulation, and international law. Prior to joining the NYU Law School as a VAP, Calderón Gómez was an associate in the tax department of Cravath, Swaine & Moore. His work has been featured or is forthcoming in the Northwestern University Law Review, Tax Law Review, Yale Journal of International Law, and the University of Pennsylvania Journal of Business Law. He holds a JD from Yale Law School, where he was the articles editor of the Yale Law Journal, and a BA from Vanderbilt University, where he graduated magna cum laude in economics and philosophy with highest honors. I'm very pleased that he's speaking here today, and he is presenting his article titled Taxation's Limits. So with that, Luís, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Leandra, for such a great introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here and bearing with me while I'll tell you about my paper. So today I'm going to be presenting my paper, Taxation's Limits. This is a paper in which I argue that the way that we've been thinking about tax exemptions generally kind of lacks kind of comprehensive theory. So the theories that we have are not great, and they can't really kind of explain or justify the exemptions that we do have, and that I propose my own theory called the limits theory that I think better fits the law that we have, better explains and justifies it, and then I try to gesture at some kind of doctrinal applications and kind of upshots of my theory. So let's see. There we go. So let's start with exemptions. So, the tax system exempts from taxation the income of a wide variety type of organizations, activities, and persons. They're quite different. So if you look at, for example, Section 1 of 501c3, it exempts the income of the, Mayo Clinic, Scientology, the Metropolitan Opera, the different food banks. Those are all very, very different types of organizations that are treated in the same way by the code. But exemptions do not only extend to those kinds of organizations. The code also exempts a broad array of kind of economic activities by other governments from their investments, right? Their investment activities by sovereign wealth funds, for example, to consular activities and their economic activities there. Lastly, we also have exemptions for certain types of income that under general principles, Hague-Simon's principles of income tax, we think they should be taxed. And here I center on the taxation of imputed income from household labor. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the idea here is that there's certain labor, non-market labor in the home that can amount to a very significant slice of economic activity that is not captured by the tax system, and that under general principles it should be. Well, we have all these very different types of exemptions. Unfortunately, we don't have a theory that can explain them. But again, before we go to a theory, I think an important question to ask is, why do we need a theory after all? I kind of present this paper usually to people. Some people like theory, some people don't. The first question I get is, why bother with theory? And I think, if you think about the need for a theory, I think we have a need because more general theories of law would presume that there's a reason for us to, would presume that we don't have exemptions. So we kind of need an affirmative explanation for a theory, if that meant for kind of the exemptions, if that makes sense. So if you take like general jurisprudential accounts of kind of the law, they generally favor laws of general applicability. If you go to Law and Fuller or something like that, we generally don't, kind of the concept of law is one that should be of general applicability, is not one that, emits of a lot of exemptions. So exemptions themselves generally have to be justified or explained by something. But even if you look at kind of tax accounts, more general tax theories, they also presume that we shouldn't have exemptions, right? So that goes both for kind of models, usually in policy, that assume that the government's profit maximizing when it's setting its kind of tax, when it's kind of organizing its tax system. So if the government's profit maximizing, it might not have exemptions, right? That's generally the finding, very broad tax base. But also that's kind of the kind of thing that you find in models that assume that we have an optimal tax system. Again, there might be a couple of exceptions there, but generally the models that assume that, kind of optimal tax theory models assume that we don't have exemptions. Okay, so if we don't, we need a theory because the theories that we have can't explain it, the general theories. The upside of a theory is that you can provide coherence to a body of the law, in this case, the exemption, kind of the law of exemptions, and justify its main features. That's especially important, I think, to have kind of a theory and kind of a normative background if you have policy debates about the law. And as we'll see, I kind of, in my paper, I talk about this transaction, the PIF PGA Tour transaction, but there's a lot more debates about tax exemptions that I think are better framed and understood when you have a theory in the background that kind of explains the law and explains why certain features are important. So there are, in my paper, I try to be kind of forthcoming and say, look, there's no comprehensive theory that has dealt with exemptions in general, but it would be misguided and misleading to say that we don't have any kind of theory right now, or that people don't have any views as to why we have tax exemptions. So here, if you look at kind of the court's case law and general kind of scholarly commentary and policymaking commentary on kind of tax exemptions, they are usually conceived of as subsidies. And these are subsidies that are just provided to whatever favored or worthy activity. Congress determines something is favored or worthy and then decides to provide a subsidy. That's sort of the idea. Obviously that puts a lot of emphasis on how we determine that something's favored or worthy, but that's kind of a different problem. These kind of theories and thoughts are usually kind of better developed in the context of the charitable exemption, which we will talk about later, but they are also invoked in the context of kind of the exemption for other sovereigns and the exemption for household labor. And that's usually how kind of policymakers and kind of scholars talk about it, even if they're not putting forth a well-developed, comprehensive, sophisticated theory. These subsidy theories, I think, have been explained again, and then the charitable context, and they've been mostly developed through law and economics, sort of typical methodology. I think that the main proponent of such a theory is Henry Hansman at Yale. Here, the main idea of why do we have a subsidy, why do we provide a subsidy to charitable organizations, is that there are quality and contracting failures in the provision of certain goods, and that kind of think about it, you want to provide aid to someone in another country. It's not easy to contract for that with a for-profit entity, right? You might be thinking, how do I know that my money is actually going to the recipient kind of on the other side of the world? There's a contracting issue there. But even if you were able to contract that out, you might think, okay, there might be issues in the quality provided. There might be incentives for this person to, for this organization to kind of take my money and not provide quality aid. to the recipient that I want to give the aid. And therefore, a more efficient way of organizing, of providing these goods is to have a nonprofit organization. So kind of the non-distribution constraint, that is the kind of not being able to distribute the profits to kind of shareholders, and in reality not having shareholders, is the kind of logical conclusion of kind of this problem with providing certain types of goods and services, right? So that's kind of enhancement's theory, how nonprofits are born. But he recognizes, look, this means if you can't provide equity and if you can't provide kind of dividends to people to give money to these organizations for them to function, there must be a way that we can incentivize people to get them money. And kind of the subsidy there is kind of tax exemption. So kind of if you want to think about it, that's kind of where the subsidy comes. These organizations provide certain goods. They can't convince investors to come kind of through kind of dividends or kind of increased equity investment. So therefore kind of they provide the tax exemption. That's kind of Hansman's theory in a nutshell. More recently, Luís has provided kind of this theory that, from an optimal tax perspective, it makes sense to provide an exemption to certain types of organizations. Why? Because they have positive, because kind of these organizations provide positive externalities. So in the same way that you have like a corrective tax to impose extra kind of costs in a producer of carbon to make sure that the kind of the social cost of carbon is internalized by the producer, in a similar way, kind of the obverse of that is to provide kind of a subsidy to someone who's producing something with a positive externality so that they'll produce more of it. And so the kind of the social benefit of their actions is accurately or appropriately internalized. So that's kind of capitalist theory. Colombo and Hull kind of have a similar kind of theory. They basically say, this is an efficient way of providing, of subsidizing goods, and kind of how do we decide what's favored or unworthy? We decide because, people, if people donate, that sort of itself proves the worth of the organization, kind of like a Vox Populi, Vox Dei sort of thing. And because they get a donation, they should get an exemption. That's sort of the idea. So you see kind of like there's this idea that, exemptions are subsidies. There might be different theories as to kind of how exactly the subsidy is provided or why it is provided. But generally, there's a law and economics kind of background to it all that try to make sense of why this features are efficient. Okay, so now we get here to my theory. So I argue that unlike what these very smart people say, the exemption regimes are not understood, should not be understood as subsidies, but are rather, better understood as kind of, downstream consequences of the fact that people think that certain things should not be taxed because they're outside of the public sphere. So this is kind of obviously a different rationale and a different way of thinking about exemptions. I argue that it's not because we want to, for example, subsidize charity, that we provide an exemption for charity, but rather because we think of it as a unique kind of hybrid entity that's outside of the state or the public sphere. Similarly, that's why we provide exemptions for kind of other governments or kind of other sovereigns, right? Because they're different public spheres. And I think for the family, that's kind of easiest to understand. Kind of you're just thinking, the family as sort of the paradigm of something that's private and intimate in nature, and that it, kind of the intrusion of the state into the family sort of rubs people the wrong way. And kind of they should be left separate. So that's kind of my, if you want to think about my theory, we'll be talking about it a little more. Here, I'm trying to, I am not trying to provide a comprehensive, I use the term public sphere, so I attempt to give you a definition or kind of some main features. Basically the idea here is provide some main features that are common to kind of how different philosophers of different stripes think of the public sphere, and that's a way, for me to say that this view is kind of not idiosyncratic, that it's fairly representative of how people think about the public sphere, right, without kind of marrying a specific type of political philosophy. So that's why I draw on Rawls, Nozick, Walzer, and so on. So here on kind of the public sphere, it's generally a space. I think there's two main components. One, that it kind of is directed at the benefit of a specified community, kind of rather than the benefit of particular individuals. So this idea of the public benefit. And the second one is that the public sphere both fosters and requires a specific set of attitudes and virtues that, again, display an orientation towards the public benefit. There's the specific kind of attitudes that are used inside of the public sphere that are kind of incompatible with kind of the attitudes and behaviors that you find in, for example, the market or in the family. Okay, so now that I've told you all of that, kind of I told you my theory, I think it's kind of best if we walk through these three different buckets that I've been kind of mentioned. These three big exemptions that I mentioned in my paper are the most significant exemptions for several reasons. We can talk about that later. And we can discuss kind of why I think the subsidy theory is inadequate in explaining the existence of such exemptions, and why, and kind of how does the limits theory kind of better capture both the kind of legal features and kind of the normative context behind these exemptions. So the first one is the nuclear family. The exemption here is for the imputed income of household labor. I think most of you will know exactly what I'm talking about with imputed income of household labor, but in case anyone needs a refresher, just imagine there's two people, right? There's Mrs. A and Mrs. B. They're both part of two different families. One of them decides to stay at home and engage in household labor, non-market household labor, while the other one decides to kind of go into the market, make money, and use that money to pay for someone to come home and do that kind of exact same household labor. Generally, when we talk about both of these, we assume that both of them have the same pre-tax income. The only difference between them is apart from the Mrs. B's kind of earnings from her job, and under general tax principles, you'd say that that despite both of them having the same kind of Higgs-Simons income, right? Or because you'd say, okay, they have this pre-tax income because of their partners, and then they both get the benefit of having all of their household labor taken care of in some way or another, right? Mrs. A does it, Mrs. B has someone do it for her. Even though they're both equally better off, Mrs. B will be taxed on her labor, that she'll be taxed more heavily than Mrs. A. That's kind of a weird effect, despite the fact that they're both better off. This has been well recognized. Henry Simons, when he's talking about kind of his income tax, recognizes this problem, recognizes that there's a reason that we should tax this income and that we should impute this income to Mrs. A, right? The value of her household labor, her non-market household labor. However, we don't do that. We exempt that, despite this being a well-known problem or a well-known problem, we haven't done that. Again, that we haven't done that because this is not because it's insignificant. It is not. There's Estimates are that this could be up to $1 trillion in economic activity every year. It's, apart from that, it's not only the amount of money, it's also highly distortionary to the labor force, as you can imagine. It forces usually the marginal worker in a couple to stay at home. And once you look at it from a gender and race ethnicity perspective, you find that the second worker usually tends to be kind of a woman, and usually tends to, and it disproportionately affects people who are Black or Hispanic. So kind of insofar there is an effect, there's a tax kind of disincentive for the second worker to actually engage in market labor that affects mostly women and Black and Hispanic people. So kind of like, okay, that's the lay of the land. How do we think of this as a subsidy theory? So this is a problem, right? How do you justify the subsidy? If you try to justify it kind of from traditional tax policy perspective, you think, okay, efficiency. It's like, well, efficiency is not great, right? There's a lot of revenue that you're leaving. It's highly distortionary to the labor force and to the economy. That's not great. There's, I think there's pretty much a consensus that it's quite inefficient. The second one, when we think about equity, from a vertical and horizontal equity perspective, again, not great. You think about Mrs. A and Mrs. B, highly inequitable from a horizontal perspective. And also, if you take a broader view of equity and you consider kind of gender, race, and ethnicity considerations, you might also be troubled by the subsidy, right? But the way most people have talked about it and justified it seems to be administrability, right? Issues of how do we, value this type of work, liquidity issues and so on. But again, there's lots of like very smart people who, Nancy Stout, who have written on kind of how the administrability issues are actually not insurmountable, and how, administrability issues haven't stopped from taxing us a lot of different things that are, much less significant than $1 trillion in economic activity, right? That seems like a lot of revenue left for administrability issues that, might not be completely or perfectly solvable, but are definitely addressable. We can talk more about the specifics of that if someone has an interest in kind of the solutions. So what I argue is that what's really going on is not that there's really insurmountable administrability issues. Even the people who talk about administrability as being kind of one of the reasons why we don't have it, kind of use it sort of as a, kind of as a pretext for what we don't tax this. But really that the reason behind it is that we think of the family as the center of the private sphere. We think of it as something that's inviolate, that's kind of too intimate to be kind of intruded by the state. We've seen this in many other areas of the law, right? Separating the family from the state, the private from the public. And if you kind of look at my kind of at the definition of the public and the private, you'd see that easily the family just does not fit there, right? The family is constituted to benefit private, right? The interests of the family, not the public interest. And there are virtues in the family, that's literally in the nature of familial relationships that just don't extend kind of the type of favoritism that you get to people in your family shouldn't extend to the public sphere. And again, that's kind of widely recognized, I think, throughout political philosophy. So that there you can think of the nuclear family as really not fitting in the public sphere mold, and because it doesn't fit, kind of it occupies the space outside. Oh, I'm seeing that I'm going a little slow in time, so I'll try to speed up here. Okay, so the second kind of bucket of exemptions I'm talking about is the other sovereigns, right? And here this exemption provides, I kind of use three different buckets if you want to think about it. The first one is the exemption for foreign governments and kind of their operations, agents, and investments. The second one concerns international organizations. And the third one, kind of sub-federal, if you want to think about it that way, domestic government. So state and local, Indian nations, and so on. So how do we justify this subsidy, right? From a subsidy theory perspective, you'd think, okay, you can make the case that these are kind of the result of sort of game theoretical, kind of if you marry law and economics and a realist view of IR, you can use kind of game theory models to kind of say, look, these are just kind of exemptions that are provided to others as kind of a way of increasing kind of the pie, cooperation, so on and so forth. There's there's a lot of literature in this area. The problem with such view, right, that just kind of takes a view that this is just a result of strategic behavior on the federal government, right, is that, it doesn't really fit the law. The first reason is that most of these exemptions are non-reciprocal. So you'd think that if there is a reason to provide those exemptions on a strategic basis, it's usually when it's reciprocal. That kind of tends to be like basic game theory. Again, you can get more complicated and try to explain it in some other ways, but it's really hard to. The second one, it's not clear that these are optimal or strategic. And in fact, if you think about the strategic and dynamics behind them, it's really hard to explain why we have them. So, the federal government could play hardball with other countries. It does so in many other areas of international tax. You can think about kind of FATCA, the CFC regime, so on and so forth, right? The US government can play hardball. So why would it give kind of exemptions to other countries when they don't require them? And why would it do so in a non-reciprocal way as a subsidy? That seems, again, non-strategic. You can think about it from the perspective of kind of state and localities, and I think that's even clearer, right? So the federal government, supreme, it's even, I would say, even more of a power dynamic between the federal government and kind of state and local governments. So it's weird that the federal government, exempts from taxation these inferior, structurally inferior governments, right? But it does. And not only does it exempt those governments, but if you look at the evolution of the law, it has even consented to those governments taxing kind of US instrumentalities and employees, even when it doesn't have to do so from a constitutional perspective, which again tells us, or at least hints, that there's something else going on. And lastly, I think that's something that's interesting is the evolving nature of this exemption. And the fact, a lot of these strategic dynamics haven't changed that much, yet the exemptions have. And the way that the exemptions have changed, for example, the intergovernmental tax immunities doctrine with the kind of evolution of thoughts about the relationship between state and federal governments, the state governments and the federal government, and kind of the evolution of the exemptions for foreign governments and how it has evolved along with the evolution of the foreign immunity doctrine. That tells you that there's something else going on. This doctrine is really not borrowing from law and economics. It's really coming from another area, and that area is these values of comity and federalism that are kind of, they generally justify carving out other public spheres. The idea here is kind of the limit of the federal government in taxing is where kind of another government starts, right? Separate spheres. Again, in the paper, I even talk about how many of these kind of seminal decisions even borrow from the language of spheres and talking about the relationship between these governments. And last but not least, and I think perhaps most interestingly, is charities. So I use the term charities here quite capaciously. I generally am trying to cover 501c3 organizations, but also 501c4s, 501c6. We can talk a little more about that and kind of exactly what's appropriate to include here. The exemption, just kind of talking about the law generally, they have an income exemption under 501(c)(3) et sec, but they also, the exemption also includes the kind of the charitable deduction, charitable contribution deduction. That's section 170. Again, I can talk more if you're interested about why I think they're kind of related as part of the same exemption regime. So how do we justify this subsidy from a kind of a law and economics, or from a subsidy law and economics perspective, which again tends to be the way that people think about it now? You just say, they provide good services. They are providing externalities. There's the enhancements, quality, and contract and failure kind of issues that we've already talked about. However, there's a lot of problems with that view. The first one that I think have been already in a significant part been kind of talked about in the literature. The first one is the problems with the types of organizations that are subsidized. It doesn't make a lot of sense to, for example, subsidize organizations that are completely at odds, right? If you are trying to produce positive externalities, why are you funding both Greenpeace and anti-environmental organizations, right? That makes no sense as a way of producing positive externalities. But also, it makes no sense to fund organizations that might not have any positive externalities, or to, here we go to the rate of subsidization, actually tailor the subsidy to how many positive externalities they provide, or the degree of positive externalities that they have. Even if you don't think that the externality reason is the one the externality rationale is the one behind the subsidy, you'd still be puzzled by the fact that we subsidize, let's say the very inefficient opera charity, right? Very inefficiently run, not providing a lot of services very well, and providing them mostly to the rich. And we subsidize in the same way kind of a very effectively run kind of food bank providing services to the poor, right? If you think about it from an externality perspective, from a quality perspective, from a contracting failure perspective, it's really hard to come up with a reason for why we treat those two the same. I think the last problem here is the commerciality. The law imposes certain bars, I would say, for organizations that engage in commercial activity from receiving exemption. So if we can talk more about this later, this example of a church kind of operating a chicken shop, using all the earnings from the chicken shop to kind of, do the church's charitable activities, right? Feed the poor. For some reason, we think that that's good. There's externalities, right? That seems like a good thing. But that's not kind of allowed under our law. That is not a good use of the charitable regime. We care about the way in which charities operate, right? Charities cannot operate in a commercial manner, and that is very hard to make sense of kind of within the subsidy theory. Why don't we just care about the goods that they're providing rather than the way they're providing them? And this takes us to the limits theory. And I think that charities are unique hybrid organizations that are directed towards the public rather than private benefit, right? That's one of the main things that charities are supposed to do. They're not supposed to benefit individuals or distinct individuals. They're supposed to benefit a community. There's lots of rules on this in the charitable sphere, kind of for example, the community benefit standard for hospitals, and so on and so forth. But also there's kind of this kind of characteristic of charities that's that they operate in a unique way. That's autonomous and private in nature. It's kind of directed towards the public good. And that's a weird combination, right? Because it's kind of a private association that's private in nature, and they care about specific things that only they care about, right? If you're PETA, you care about animals and you care about them in a very specific way, in a way that might not be consonant with the way that you might think about it in the public sphere, but you're caring about the the public benefit. And if you look at political theory, there's lots of reasons why you think that those types of private associations are very important and should be sheltered from the state, not only because they kind of are the kind of starting ground for important civic virtues that kind of have to develop there and then kind of go to the public sphere, but also because kind of market and state intervention in kind of the charities would kind of change the way they operate and devalue the way they operate and the services they provide. I can say more about that later. Lastly, I've been talking about theory all along, why my theory is so great, yada, yada. What are the doctrinal upshots? I'll go pretty quickly. The first one, I think this clarifies and rationalizes common features of the law. The kind of a big one is the commerciality principle. Why do we have this? And why do we have this across exemptions, not just in one? The second was the public policy principle. Why do we care about whether someone follows public policy when giving an exemption if it's all about subsidies? But I think it also, again, as we mentioned, it makes policy debates seem more intelligible and kind of frames it in a way that makes sense. And I think it explains the criticisms of this PIF PGA Tour deal, and kind of it provides blueprints for kind of clarifying the law and making it more coherent. Again, and kind of, I also think that kind of this theory, provides a guide, a blueprint, let's say, for kind of future work on exemptions and kind of a more doctrinal level. I'm looking at charities, so thinking about kind of the structure of the deduction, why actually we might prefer a deduction from a credit or a cap deduction. Why we have the UBIT, I think is a big one, the unrelated business income tax. Or why we should tax universities and endowments, which I think is a fairly hot topic right now. Okay, so with that, thank you so much for bearing with me. I know I went a little on time, but